And we are live. Okay, this is take two of this interview. So thank you all for joining us. I want to recognize that it is Blackout Tuesday, hence our lovely black screen here in the middle. And I am joined today again with the writer, journalist, educator, and community activist Samuel Adams, whose picture you see at his request. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming back for day two. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
We did have a little technical difficulty yesterday, but I think that's going to make this interview twice as strong. So Sam and I know each other from God. It's been over 15 years since I lived in Chicago and was neighbors with Sam. So he's one of the few people in my life who has really been a staple and been there for a long time. So I'm very grateful for that. So Sam, do you want to give us, for us, please define who you are and what you do?
I am the sixth child and fourth son born to Irving and Ruth Adams. There's seven of us. I wish I could name all the names, but sometimes that slips. I'm joking. Irving, Novita, Joseph, Addie, James, myself, Julie. See, named all seven.
Nice.
I grew up in Delray Beach, Florida. It's a small beachfront town not far from Miami. And I had a pretty normal childhood for an African-American male growing up, born a few years after the Civil Rights Movement ended. So I've been a writer I wrote my first piece when I was 17, and I've been writing ever since, so over 30 years.
Wow, fantastic. So you say you grew up in Florida. Were your parents native to there, or did they move there to raise you?
So my father was born in Pompano Beach, Florida in the 30s, and my mom was born in the late 30s, early 40s in Delray Beach, where my hometown was. And of course, they were born and raised colored in the Jim Crow South. So which really helped shape who I am, that my mother and father rode the back of the bus, couldn't cross the tracks at a certain time, had to be home at a certain time, had to fear for their very lives in the Jim Crow South, which meant a Black person could be exploited, raped, or murdered at any time. So that's what they were brought up with. So when I was born in the 70s, when supposedly those things had come to an end, my parents understood they had to raise their seven kids with an understanding that racism is alive and well, but with the hope and faith of improving society. And that was the challenge that always existed, that balance they had to create. Keep us safe in a world that was still dominated by white supremacy and racism, but also instill in us values that dedicated our minds and lives and spirits to this can be a better world with your donation, with your efforts in whatever you become in life. So that was instilled in us from an early age.
Nice. Thank you for sharing. I think that's really important, and people don't realize how recent that really was. And we're just talking about your parents' generation. So I appreciate the context there. And now, was art always prevalent in your family? Were your parents artists, or how did art play into your childhood development?
Music, I will say music defined my childhood. It was always around. Gospel music, jazz, pop. My mother played piano, she played violin, she sang, and that was always in our home. My uncle had a PhD in organ. He was a music teacher. My second oldest brother played clarinet for years. And growing up, my mom and father made sure we went to museums, plays, saw artwork in our home on the walls and around. We were inundated by art. So that became a part of me. It became it became an integral part of understanding who I was, not only as a Black person, but as part of being a global citizen, of the beauty that I could donate. And so when I was a kid, I was given a poetry book by Langston Hughes. My mother gave that to me, and I couldn't stop reading it. The poem that just drew me to it was A Negro Speaks of Rivers. And it's such a beautiful poem. It's still to this day one of my favorite poems that I try to read at least once a week. Reading that at the age of 7, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to write poetry and use words in a creative manner. And that was always encouraged in my household. My mom and dad encouraged artistic endeavors. And I entered writing competitions and poetry contests and things of that sort because it was encouraged. That it was in my home. The library in our home was filled with books about Black art, about art from Africa, about African American artists. And so that really played a part in me understanding that even though when I went to school, my public school education and my quote unquote higher level classes that I took, I only saw white artists. I only saw Beethoven, Tchaikovsky. I learned about Gregorian chants. I didn't learn about jazz. I didn't learn about Oscar Peterson or Quincy Jones or Miles Davis or Duke Ellington. Those weren't the names that were told to me in school. But when I got home, those names were taught to me, the beauty of their music, the writing. So my parents provided me a balance with the traditional education I was getting in school and then at home. My parents understood that even though that schools were now integrated, they did not trust that the white power structure would educate their Black children properly. And I thank God that they had that mistrust, because due to that mistrust, my parents made sure at home I was given a foundation in understanding what it was to be a Black person, what it was that my legacy and my culture really meant, that I was not born enslaved, that our ancestors from Africa created colleges, they created systems of living, they created a world that existed before my ancestors were brought here on slave ships. So having that foundation at home, when I went to school, even though I heard things and was subtly attacked, my self-image was attacked because you never see reflections of yourself in the curriculum, in the art, in the education, in who they claim to be the most intelligent minds that ever lived. You never saw your own reflection as a Black person. But when I went home, my parents made sure there was an effort dedicated to knowing W.E.B. Du Bois was a genius. Paul Robeson was a genius. Sarah Vaughan was a genius.
Yeah, nice.
I mean, all these individuals Marcus Garvey, these individuals were brilliant, and I was made aware of them by my family. So that instilled a level of self-confidence when I went to places that attempted to take away from who I was, especially in the artistic world, because I think there is, in particularly, a level of white dominance when it comes to the arts, and that oftentimes people of color feel like we're outsiders even when we're on the inside participating. Misty Copeland has spoken about this. She's spoken about how it is that your body had to be a certain way and how you had this look that apparently as a Black woman, she didn't have. But we have had to look our own way and create our own way, another way, to develop our own sense of what is artistic and what is beautiful, and not measure it against what the European standard is. We had to understand that our own sense of creativity, our own artistic palette was just as valuable and just as meaningful and just as important to the global donation of art to art as anyone else's. So that was very important, especially when I was writing poetry and doing creative writing.
Yeah, I think representation is so important. I've heard artists of color speak about that, and I have to say, you know, when I was living in Chicago and teaching as well, that you introduced me to a lot of, you know, Black authors and a lot of this Black art because I was not exposed to it in school either. So, you know, I just have to say thank you for that, because I do think representation in education is really important. So, and in the arts, obviously. And so then you went to Morehouse, which I imagine was a very different experience.
It was amazing.
And then, yeah, so
tell us about your Morehouse. I attended Morehouse. So as I said before, I was always one of two, possibly three on a good day, of Black students in a classroom filled with white students. And by the time I became a senior in high school, I knew I needed something different. I needed another way, so to speak. And there's an interesting story where I always call it the tale of two teachers. My favorite teacher, Miss Barbara Norris, who I've written about several times, I was kind of on the fence on where I wanted to go to college. Just like any 17, 18-year-old kid, you're like weighing the pros and cons. It's your first major life decision that's going to affect the rest of your life. And I was very unsure. So there were a few institutions I was considering. And I went to a basketball game and I saw Miss Norris. She happened to be at the game. And she taught me seventh grade science. And let me just give a little background to why she meant so much to me. Miss Norris wasn't just an educator. She invested in me as a human being. She didn't just teach science. She taught me to be a better person. And that's what she always made sure I understood, that I had value as a human being and that I had a responsibility to those who came before and sacrificed to make sure that their sacrifice was not in vain. So as a junior high schooler, I used to get in a lot of trouble. I was kind of mischievous, to say the least. So I'd get kicked out of classes sometimes. And I will never forget this one time I was kicked out of my reading teacher's class. And I'm in the hallway and I see Miss Norris coming down the hallway. And I know she's not just going to walk by and just go to her room. That's not how that worked. And I got the look. She gave me the look from all the way down the hallway, the look of, this is not acceptable. She was like, why are you out in the hallway? And I was like, well, he said, and she was like, you're going to go back in that classroom and you're going to be respectful. You're going to sit down and do what you're supposed to do. Do you understand me? And I was like, yes, ma'am. And I went back in that classroom and there were no more problems. So that's the type of investment and respect that I always had for her. So fast forward 5 years, when I'm sitting at this basketball game and I'm weighing my pros and cons of different institutions, she starts talking. She's like, well, where are you going to college and what are you thinking about? And I was like, well, one of my options is Morehouse. And she was like, I don't need to hear anything else. That's where you need to go. And that meant so much to me. I was just like, wow. Now, the previous week, there was another teacher who approached me about the colleges I was considering. This teacher happened to be white. And this teacher pulled me out of my physics class, which that didn't bother me too much. Wasn't a fan of physics. And wanted to have a conversation with me about where I was going to go to college. So I told him that, there were these different choices, and a few of the choices are very, elite institutions. I won't name them, but when he found out that I was considering Morehouse, he felt he needed to speak to me. So he pulled me aside, just 9 o'clock, I will never forget this. He told me that going to an historically black college or university was not in my best interest. I would not receive a quality education. Those institutions didn't produce the types of individuals that would change the world.
What?
That yes, this is what was told to me. I sat
What
there.
year?
This is 1991. I'm sitting there.
Wow.
I'm sitting there dumbfounded. My father graduated an historically black college university, FAMU, which is in Tallahassee, Florida. My mom, Tennessee State University, which was an historically black college university. My dad, after graduating FAMU, attended Harvard Law School.
Right.
My aunts and uncles all attended historically black colleges and universities. The people in my community attended them. Dr. Martin Luther King attended Morehouse College, Spike Lee, Maynard Jackson, the list goes on. But all he knew was it's black, therefore it has to be less than. Wow, I will never forget sitting there, listening to him speak, and the more he spoke of telling me not to go there and not to do that, the more he was convincing me on why I should attend.
Right.
So by the time I spoke to Miss Norris, it was between two institutions, and when she said Morehouse, that sealed the deal for me. The person who cared about who I was as a human being, not only as a student, her saying you should go to Morehouse, that's all I needed to hear. I trusted her. And so, yeah. And so when I became a teacher, I wanted to give...
You taught at multiple schools. You taught at Urban Prep,
which is... I taught at two schools. I taught at the Choir Academy of Chicago for 4 years, and I taught at Urban Prep for 8 years. So when I became a teacher, I wanted to instill in my students the same things that Miss Norris instilled in me. That who you were as human beings, your value to society, those things are important. And when I taught at an all-black male school for 8 years, I wanted to make sure those kids were understanding that your brain worked as well as anyone's. That even though society had told you whites are smarter, they're more talented, those were lies. That you are of value, and that I'm going to teach you about Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey. You're going to learn about these individuals whose brilliance and whose independent thinking transformed not only their lives, but the world. And that those same individuals, their brilliance is inside of you. You possess that same DNA. And I'm going to make sure you understand that every single day you walk this planet, you have a responsibility to make sure the world knows of your brilliance, and you share that brilliance with them. No matter what they do to attempt to stop or prevent you, you possess something that is greater than the odds against you. So,
absolutely. So let me ask you this, because I know you are a writer, obviously, and a journalist, but you are, from what I know of you, you are equally passionate about education and educating communities even. And one of the things that I've always admired about you, and it's clear when you speak, is that you have a very clear purpose, and you are and a vision. And the work I do with artists, we always start with vision work. Why? What is your purpose, basically? Finding your why. And one of the things I've learned is that, in part, I think, because I've known you and I've seen this in you, is that part of my art is really how I express my purpose, my vision. And so, what would you say your art is? Because you have had so much impact in all these different areas. What would you say, what boils down to what is your art?
There's definitely an interconnecting thread throughout my teaching, my writing, my community activism. It's all interconnected, and it all goes back to my parents, what they taught us as kids, that whatever you do it to improve the community. You do it to improve those around you. You don't see injustice and walk away or turn a blind eye. That was just totally unacceptable in my house, ever. And that's something I learned as, I'm thinking of like 5, from whenever I can remember breathing, it was made sure to be understood that injustice in improving society was your responsibility, no matter what your job was, no matter what career path you chose. What you did, the center focus was you help end injustice and improve society. So everything I've written about, every job I've ever held, every mentoring position I've ever had, that's always the nucleus. Improving society, ending injustice. One of the things one of the things that I've always, it's kind of hurt me presently. Artists are supposed to be revolutionaries. Artists are supposed to lead the way in transforming societies, not politicians, not even teachers. Artists have a specific view, a specific talent that can critique society in a way that no one else can, and it reaches the ears and hearts of people in a way that really nothing else can. Writers, singers, poets, painters, throughout history, there was a reason why governments attempted to control, imprison, or even kill artists, because those individuals spoke to the common man and the man sitting on the throne in a way, wow, that's powerful. That can change lives. We need to make sure that that individual is controlled. And I think what we see today, unlike the 60s where you had Joan Baez, Nina Simone, Marvin Gaye, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, John Lennon, Bob Dylan, those individuals were, I'm not just writing a song to, hey, here's a nice happy song for you. That's not what they did. They wrote revolutionary music. They wrote music that said wars should come to an end. Fascism is wrong. Sexism is wrong. Racism is wrong. And we need to dismantle the institutions that promote these ways of thinking. Those artists were not welcome in the halls of Congress or in the White House. Those individuals were seen as, you are the enemy of the status quo. Fast forward to today, you do have some artists that are still placing themselves as, we're going to speak out. We're going to speak truth to power. We're going to speak out against injustice. But all too often, there are many artists who use their incredible gifts and talents and amazing voice for their bank account, for their own selfish needs. And they don't realize how their art would be even more just transcendent if it reached the world and with a message of transformation. That's why Stevie Wonder's my favorite artist. Stevie Wonder's been my favorite artist since I've been a kid, because Stevie Wonder sings about songs to transform our society. The Happy Birthday song, which many people know of, was regarding Dr. King's holiday before it became a holiday. He'd been campaigning for years to get it to become a holiday. His songs about love, his songs in support of the impoverished, the outcast. Stevie Wonder has dedicated his life to making music that was dedicated to transforming society. And we need more artists like that today. We need more artists to do that.
I appreciate the call to action. So all you artists out there, hear the call, because I think you're right. But I will say that I have heard some quarantine music that has come out. I've been calling it quarantine music. I think artists are starting to kind of address social issues a little bit more than maybe they have in recent years. But I agree with you that I think in general, maybe a lot of people have kind of lost their way. And so, and that is, again, part of the work that I do is trying to realign that. And that is realigning their art with their purpose, which is the whole point of Another Way. And actually, I might even go so far as to say that words are your paintbrush. So that is kind of how you have been able to translate your purpose into your art, which you've demonstrated for us already. So thank you for that. Let me slightly change the topic. You, as a journalist, you are actively covering what is going on right now. The protests, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which did not start this year. And I know you've been following it for a really long time. So tell us what you've seen going on, your interpretation of what is happening right now.
It seems like we're living in a society that is constantly on the brink because it refuses to deal with its history of white supremacy and racism. America's original sin of genocide and racism, genocide against Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans. They have refused for centuries to address that issue. And because of that, it's manifested itself in systemic institutional racism. And what has always been one of the most dangerous situations in our society is when Black people have to interact with the police. Every Black parent I've ever met has had that conversation with their child. My parents had 2 conversations with me. I was 11 or 12. The 2 conversations that most Black parents who are my age had with their kids about the 2 things that can kill Black people, Black boys, Black men especially, the police and white women. There's a history of both of those taking the lives of Black men. I mean, we saw what Amy Cooper did in Central Park, where she weaponized her whiteness, understanding that as a white woman, saying that a Black male was threatening her, what historically that meant. What the end result.
Right. Let me just say she is not representative of the majority of New York. And I've spoken to a lot of New Yorkers about that. So
we'd like to think so. But
right.
There is an understanding that every Black male has that we know what the end result of someone, a white woman saying that I have accosted her or I am threatening her. History tells me that ends with a Black male having his genitalia cut off and being hung from a tree. That's what American history tells us. American history tells me that when the police pull me over or attempt to talk to me using terms like "you fit the description" or asking questions like "why are you in this neighborhood?" we understand that leads to us dying. So those are conversations that have been had. When I look at what's been happening to Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and most recently, Mr. Floyd, I look at that and I'm at a place where I know that something needs to change, because how much longer can a group of people continue to accept that? We saw a Black man on his stomach, handcuffed, 3 police officers on him, 1 police officer with his knee in his neck for nearly 10 minutes, while he cried out, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And then his final words were calling on his mother, his deceased mother, before he passed away. Any human being with any type of human sympathy or dignity would look at that and say there's a problem. So now what are we dealing with? We're dealing with protests. We're dealing with people who are upset. And one thing I will not do, and I've been on a couple panels already discussing this, I will not condemn any Black person how they choose to protest. This country has.
For a second, because I want to go there. I want to talk about that, but I also just want to say really quickly before we move past what you just said, and also I want to acknowledge that usually my interviews end around now, but I think this is a really important conversation that I want to continue. So I want to extend this one. I think we can go an hour, which we should try not to keep it under an hour. But I do want to say before we move on to this next topic, which is very important, that I have noticed in these protests, different than before, that there has been a lot of different colored skins participating in these protests. You know, I've even seen signs that say Jews for Black Lives Matter, and businesses are sending out emails saying we stand with you for this movement. And so there has been a lot of people who are not traditionally out there fighting for these issues who are standing up right now. Would you agree with that?
Yes, they're which lends some credence of hope to what could happen. But as long as I keep hearing politicians highlighting behaviors about the protests instead of the behaviors of the murderous police, I still think there's a problem. And I still, even when I turn the television on or check out Twitter or any of the various newspapers or media outlets, I still see this condemning of the condemnation of protests. And I have been resolute in that I will not condemn any Black person on how they choose to protest. We have lived in a country for 400 years that has economically exploited, that has raped, that has murdered us, and yet there has been no justice for that. So when the same people who have actively oppressed Black people say, well, yes, we know something's been done wrong to you once again, but here are the rules for how we feel comfortable with you protesting. That's something I cannot abide. First, when a person's abused, you don't tell the abused individual to behave a certain way while the abuse continues. And that's what's being asked of us. Please, we're asking that end the illegal activity, end the abuse, then you'd be shocked that you wouldn't see the types of protests that you feel uncomfortable with. But as long as the abuse continues, you need to be prepared for us, for Black people, to protest in any way that makes us feel comfortable or allows us to vent our frustrations. 400 years of them. So that's something that I don't know if white society is prepared for, to see or to deal with.
Well, we're finding out.
Hopefully it will not come to that. I mean, Colin Kaepernick tried to kneel peacefully and he was ostracized. So
well, and traditionally the leaders who have risen up in these movements traditionally have all been systematically either quieted, either killed or sent away from the country or left the country. And so I also think kind of what you're saying falls in line with Malcolm X's messaging, who I know you respect Malcolm X a great deal. And I was in a conversation last night where I found myself trying to explain it, and I don't think I did it justice. But kind of what I said was, Malcolm X's point was not, even though I know he said these things, the point was not meet violence with violence. The point was kind of meet force with force. So it doesn't have to mean violent, but it also means you cannot dictate to me how to retaliate because you didn't let me dictate how you got to treat me, basically. Something to that extent. Would you agree with that?
Self-defense. I mean, Malcolm X, El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, his words are, defending, we should be allowed to defend ourselves, which I don't understand how that in itself makes many whites fearful, to say that I will not allow you to hit me without me hitting you back. That message was seen as violence or militant, and it's not. That's the human reaction. But when you are Black, you are not allowed to be angry. You're not allowed to have natural human reactions and responses to violence done to you. We are supposed to go meekly into the night and accept whatever evil or injustice is done to us, and we are supposed to pray it away and forgive.
Right.
That is what most whites expect. And if you go on social media, many whites say they will unfortunately misquote Dr. King. And I always leave a message saying, you know he got killed, right? He was murdered. You're saying do this, do that, do what Dr. King would do. And Dr. King was assassinated by, just like George Floyd was, just like Breonna Taylor, he was murdered.
Right.
So you're ultimately saying I should relent and take the path that will ultimately get me killed and not do anything to prevent that. That is white supremacy and racism in a way that, well, let me change that. That response comes from many white progressives who only feel comfortable with Black people coordinating themselves and organizing themselves and protesting in a way that makes them feel comfortable. They have taken the message of Dr. King and whitewashed it, because they really don't know the real Dr. King. His quotes are much more in depth than what they use. And they use his words in a way to control the behavior of Black people today. If you ever notice, I see quotes all the time where it's like, people who I know do not like Black folks. They will use a Dr. King quote about peace and justice, or their favorite one, only love can drive out hate and darkness. And I'm just like, yet when he was murdered, they didn't lift a finger to change anything about that then.
Right.
So when people attempt to manipulate Dr. King's message to control the behaviors of Black people, it's a sad thing that we've reached that point. But like you said before, I do have some hope. There is hope. What I'm seeing in these protests gives me hope and faith that maybe we're at a turning point. But hope and faith are not the same as confidence. Right. Because history tells me white folks like being white folks. And there's an arrogance to white supremacy that is going to be very difficult to chisel through.
Right. Well, it certainly doesn't happen in a day. That's for sure. So I do think it's positive that there's a lot of support across the board for this. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this curfew, because my thoughts were that it feels to be almost goading the politicians and the police force, law enforcement. Certainly in New York City and a lot of the big cities, they're in each other's pockets traditionally, deeply in each other's pockets. So it's very hard politically to separate the two. And I understand certainly the reasoning behind wanting to impose these curfews. But the stronger they are about the curfews, the more I feel like they're just fanning these flames, and it's going to make things a lot worse. What do you think?
All attempts by those in power to maintain peace and order instead of justice are always acts of maintaining the white supremacy hierarchy. Curfews, bus shutting down the local transit systems. All of those things are simply efforts to bring about peace and order, not justice.
Peace and order.
I haven't heard any efforts by these same individuals who are spending millions to put police out to protect property. But yet, when it comes to justice and having an emergency session of Congress to say, we need to address the police violence toward blacks right now, that's not happening.
Right,
so,
and I agree.
So any of those actions to me seem just a method of maintaining the power of those in power, maintaining it and showing it.
Okay.
I said before, the individual living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue currently, who is fanning the flames of racism and white supremacy, he's not the source. He's just one actor in a long line of politicians, presidents, senators, congressmen who have manipulated racism to get what they needed. Now, he may be the worst to do it in modern history, but he's not the first. And there have been black bodies laid out in the streets because of police officers from Eisenhower in the 50s to right now in 2020. We've been talking about police brutality for decades. And here's America's test once again. Dr. King brought it up. W.B. Du Bois brought it up 40 years previous to that. It was brought up in South Africa when the apartheid police were killing blacks left and right.
Yeah, and rioting is also new.
Yeah, here's the test. Will America finally pass this test that police brutality needs to end? And I don't know if it'll ever occur. I don't know if they can root out. I don't know if they can root out the deeply seated systemic racism that exists.
And
in
that's
the police department.
Systemic. Absolutely agreed. I want to read a couple quotes. One is from a protester who in Brooklyn, New York. So one of the New York protests. And he said, Jermaine Williams was his name. He said, those of you who are asking for peace, please ask for justice. It is morally irresponsible to ask for peace and not for justice. So I agree with that. And
100% accurate. People who ask for peace, when I meet people who say we need peace, we just need things to calm down, those individuals are not on my side in regards to, you don't want to see my life improve. All you want to do is you want to go back to living behind your white picket fence and to be able to watch television, to watch The Bachelorette, The Bachelor, whatever, the Kardashians in peace and not be disturbed by images on your television of people going to your local Target and now it's closed so you can't go there. You don't want to be inconvenienced. You don't want justice. You want convenience for your life to continue.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone has a solution yet, because as you point out, there are systemic issues at stake here, entire industries that have been built on discrimination and racism. So I don't think anyone has the answers, but one of the things that stands out to me about that quote specifically too is that I also think that we're just not talking about the right issues. It is not a matter of peace at this point, it is a matter of justice. So I think asking the right questions and talking about the right issues, getting us focused is ideally where I think we need to be. And I want to read one more quote to you, which I was so excited to share with you yesterday to hear your response. So this is the second time you've heard this, but this is from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And the quote is, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should seek salvation. We do pray for mercy.
Amen.
And nice.
Amen.
Yeah,
that's one of my favorite pieces by Shakespeare. And I don't think people grasp the fact that in my pursuit of justice, I am not in any attempt trying to be the perfect angel of enlightenment. What I am attempting to do is to lift this burden, this yoke of injustice from upon my neck, And in doing that, those who are in my way need to really ask for mercy so that I do not, in my pursuit of my justice and them attempting to prevent that, that can be a hostile situation. And they should seek mercy. They should hope that mercy is one of the cornerstones. But it's always been for Black people. Black people have always been ready to forgive and be a part of America. But, you know, America has been, I mean, America is the most abusive lover that you could ever have. But Black Americans keep going back to him. We will not give up, ever. But yet we've never, and we have PTSD that's at a level that's ridiculous. Right. But we keep going back to that same significant other who abuses us. Because we have hope in America.
I think the quote was trying to say, though, that have mercy for all of us. We all have, you know, please let us.
That's one way of looking at it. I think when you apply it to right now, you might see it a different way.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just watched a video this morning of a woman, I think she was in the Bronx, but I actually don't know where in New York, but you know, she was pleading, just get out of our neighborhood. You know, we just want to go home because the curfew, you know, they're coming in. There's a lot of homeless people, I guess, in that neighborhood who don't have a home to go to. And then, you know, the cops are coming in and kicking people off the streets. And she's like, whoa, we're just trying to survive here and live here, which PS is difficult because of all this systematic racism. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. I mean, I think she was certainly asking for mercy. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's a complicated issue for sure.
Very complicated. But one of the things when people have been pushed to a point of they no longer can trust the quote unquote systems that have been set up for their justice. So now they have to seek justice on their own. Mercy is a word that might need to be thrown out. It might need to be thrown out because we need to think that there are people who are angry, there are people who are frustrated, and they've been pushed to this point because they live in a society that has chosen to dedicate itself to killing them and not giving justice for those deaths. So it's a rough way to go.
It is. We're going to circle back to this at the end, I think, but I want to ask you two more questions. One is, where do Black women stand in this movement? Because I know Black women have traditionally,
they're the foundation. They're the foundation. Black women have always been.
Nice.
Black women have always been the foundation of our community. From the moment we got off the boat in Jamestown in 1619, on those plantations, throughout the civil rights movement, Jim Crow, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Dr. Dorothy Height, Angela Davis, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, my grandmother Addie Jane Blackshear Daniels, my mom Ruth Marie Adams. Those women always stood resolute against white supremacy more than anyone else. Black women, the Democratic Party's number one group, the most dedicated group in fighting Trump, Black women. Black women have over time stood their ground in a way against white supremacy and racism that Black men couldn't, because oftentimes they were seen as an immediate threat. They get killed immediately. But even times when the family had to be held together during enslavement, and the fathers or the sons were ripped from the family, the Black mother held those families together. So there's a tradition of Black women revolutionaries that we stand on the shoulders of, that Barack Obama and Dr. King and all the Black men who get a great deal of publicity receive, but Black women have always been the backbone of the Black community, and they still are at this very moment. Stacey Abrams, my classmate from college, hopefully will be the next vice president of the United States. I mean,
Nice.
she is a prime example of the Black backbone of the progressive movement. And Black women also have also been tasked in our society with being the educators of white women on how to properly protest and organize. When we look at the suffrage movement or the women's movement, those movements were highly racist and did not accomplish what they could have accomplished if women of color would have been actively allowed to participate. Only once, when Black women were allowed to participate, did things change. I've always said this: when a Black woman opens a door, it's open for everyone. When white women open doors, they're usually open for only white women. And that's a dangerous way to see things.
Yeah, I would not rush to say that, to couple all white women into that statement, but I know the argument that traditionally the feminist movement has been seen as leaving out Black women. And if everything you say, I think is important to say, and I appreciate that. And I actually hope to have a Black woman speak for herself soon, hopefully next week in another interview. So I also wanted to ask you what you thought about, just from an education point of view, what you thought about Michelle Obama's work, because I know with her book tour for her book Becoming, she's really targeted schools and specifically women, but her message applies to everybody, and it's this message of really becoming who you are, regardless of who you are. And I think she's an important role model. It's important for people to see her. And I think her work actually, in some ways, should be put into education, just as a staple. What do you think of that?
Education has failed in so many levels. I think right now that COVID-19 and the closing of our schools, it has provided the opportunity to do education another way. There you go. Yeah. And that is very important. Right now, being in the midst of the pandemic and these protests, the pandemic has closed, quote unquote, churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship. But I think it was the first wake up call for those places to realize that building is not the place of God. That building is not where the spiritual movement occurs.
Right.
Places of worship have figured this out. Schools haven't figured it out yet. So this is the opportunity for schools to look at themselves and realize, you know what? The building should not be the center of where education and learning happens. It's wherever the students are. So the curriculums need to be transformed. This is an opportunity to say, hey, let's do this a different way. When you have people like Michelle Obama or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or any of these individuals who want to go into schools and talk to students, that education is every bit as important as what they learn in the classroom on a regular, everyday basis.
Right.
So therefore, we need to visualize education in a different way, not children going into a building, sitting in a classroom, and listening to someone talk to them all day long. COVID-19, this pandemic, has allowed us to hopefully view school can be done in a different way, in a way that's more effective to each individual student, to each individual learner, each child.
Yes, catering to the individual. Yes, I agree. We don't all learn the same way. So yeah, I think that's really important. It's also a much larger conversation, I think, that you and I could have, maybe even should have.
That could be a part 2.
Yeah, exactly. But I kind of wanted to leave you with, and we'll get your final words for sure, but could you agree with the statement that if you go underneath social conditioning, systematic discrimination, and constitutional rights, if you go underneath all of those things, that we are one? at the end of the day?
That should be our goal. Our goal should be to become one, to become united as citizens not only of our nation but of our planet, to become citizens that look out for each other. That should be our goal, to become one, to create a togetherness, a union that is unbreakable. But at the moment, we are on the path to creating that. And the journey to creating that oneness, it's a bumpy path. There's going to be blood, sweat, and tears shed before we reach the point of becoming one. So I am all for the journey. I just hope others are also. And sometimes on the path, we have to remove the impediments, and that those people might be friends, family, who are the individuals preventing us from becoming one. So I tell everybody to get the tools ready, get your walking shoes, and it's going to be a long walk to freedom.
Beautiful. And I just want to say that you also quite perfectly summed up my book. Thank you very much. Another Way, The Tao of Artist Development, which is about that journey, I'd say.
Quite true.
Because I would want to say to people that one of the things we need to remember right now, as tensions are so high and people are pushing, you know, what they really believe in, and everyone believes in different things, is that we need to remember that we all came from the earth, if you will. We were all born out of something, if you want to call it the Big Bang even, right? And then we will all return to, as in our physical bodies, will return to the same thing. We're all coming from and going to the same place, regardless of the color of our skin. And I know that gets into philosophy and into spirituality, but I think the message for me is to remember that this is all transitory, and that it is not worth, you know, bloodshed, you know, kind of, or whatever. Maybe certain cases, maybe it is. But the point is, I would say, to try to focus on hope, instead of the doom and the gloom. That's kind of a nice go-to, certainly for me. And it's one of my hashtags, by the way, #WeAreOne. So thank you so much, Sam Adams. This has been incredible. And I really, really think we should do this on a regular basis. So that's something to talk about. But do you have any final words?
Live long and prosper.
What?
So,
you can do better than that.
I want everyone, seriously, what's going on around the world, what's going on with the pandemic, what's going on with the protests. Be careful not to become emotionally overwhelmed. Make sure you place yourself spiritually and emotionally in a place where you can decompress and not lose yourself to what's going on around you. That could be a danger. There needs to be a balance of maintaining your own mental health, your spiritual health, and not putting yourself in a position where you are inundated, you are overwhelmed with information that consumes your very soul. Don't allow that to happen to you, because once your soul is corrupted, it's very difficult to get it back.
Beautiful. Samuel Adams. You'd think he was a writer or something. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Again, I know you are very busy right now with a lot of interviews and things, so thank you for taking the time. I do want to tell everyone to follow you on social, because you've been publishing some beautiful poems, speaking of your beautiful words.
Yeah, my Instagram, God With Me 64. It's the same thing for my Instagram and my Twitter. God With Me 64. Great.
And I will post that in the comments and on the video. This video will be available on YouTube, so stay tuned for that at TSGO Prods. This is a conversation that needs to continue. I think people should be having it around the world, so please share. And I again want to acknowledge that today is Blackout Tuesday, and so we are pausing from work to discuss these community issues. So thank you again for joining me, Sam.
Anytime. Take care.
Take
God bless.